Hello everyone, and welcome to the podcast. Today we are reviewing, of course, Justice is Fairness, a restatement by John Rawls, and today we're looking at Chapter 2. I have a lot of issues with Chapter 2. Chapter 2 seems to gloss over a whole lot of the problems that exist in liberal democracy, that seem to exist in free market capitalism, and doesn't address some of the points that I brought up in part of Chapter 1. I'm really worried where this book is heading now, and I'm kind of convinced that perhaps Rawls didn't have a great conception of what democracy ought to operate as, or really what is just in a political system. But without further ado, let's get into it and address it point by point. Starting with a section from Rawls from early in the chapter. In particular, let us suppose that the fundamental social and economic inequalities are the differences in citizens' life prospects, their prospects over a complete life, as these are affected by such things as their social class of origin, their native endowments, their opportunities for education, and their good or ill fortune over the course of life. We ask, by what principles are differences of that kind, differences in life prospects, made legitimate and consistent with the idea of free and equal citizenship in society seen as a fair system of cooperation? So Rawls starts out the chapter by trying to describe or understand when is inequality okay, what makes inequality okay, is inequality okay, and how can we describe what inequalities are okay or not okay. He then continues further in the chapter. A. It is a relationship of persons within the basic structure of society, a structure we enter only by birth and exit only by death. Political society is closed, as it were, and we do not, and indeed cannot, ever enter or leave it voluntarily. B. Political power is always coercive power applied by the state and its apparatus of enforcement. But, in a constitutional regime, political power is at the same time the power of free and equal citizens as a collective body. Thus, political power is citizens' power, which they impose on themselves and one another as free and equal. So this, again, starts to worry me. We have started with saying, okay, we're going to describe inequality and when inequality is okay or not okay. Now we're talking about, okay, well, what are the principles of power in our society? Where does the ability to regulate or rule over society come from? And Rawls concludes that, well, it's just if it comes from the people and they're consenting to be ruled by themselves. One of the things that's interesting is that I know, just based on having read things about Rawls in the past, and based on some of the things that we discussed in Chapter 1, that Rawls is, in essence, okay with the system of government that exists in the United States, the constitutional democracy that we have. And so I know that he believes that that system is, if not just, then at least the beginning of a model that could be just. He argues that we should be beholden to the basic structure of an executive and the legislative and the judicial in the way that those are set up now, and that could potentially be just because we've agreed to it. But then here, he goes on to say, well, but we all agree to this imposition of power upon ourselves, when that simply isn't the case. As we discussed in our thought experiment last week, there are situations in which the executive having the kind of power that it has leads to lots of different issues for lots of different people. So much so that a group of them decided to storm the Capitol recently, something that we haven't seen in modern history. So clearly this system is either not just, or at the very least, doesn't work for some people, perhaps many people. So is it really something that we're imposing on ourselves, or is it something that's being imposed on us by our ancestors, by the people who created this system in the first place? Can the system be just if we don't all consent to it, if we don't agree to how it operates? Anyway, let's continue on. Rawls continues, the idea here is to use our firmest considered convictions about the nature of a democratic society as a fair system of cooperation between free and equal citizens, as modeled in the original position, to see whether the combined assertion of these convictions so expressed will help us to identify an appropriate distributive principle for the basic structure with its economic and social inequalities in citizens' life prospects. To this end, fair equality of opportunity is said to require not merely that public offices and social positions be open in the formal sense, but that all should have a fair chance to attain them. To specify the idea of a fair chance, we say, supposing that there is a distribution of native endowments, those who have the same level of talent and ability and the same willingness to use these gifts should have the same prospects of success regardless of their social class of origin, the class into which they are born and develop until the age of reason. In all parts of society, there are to be roughly the same prospects of culture and achievement for those similarly motivated and endowed. But then later, Rawls states, the fair value of the political liberties ensures that citizens similarly gifted and motivated have roughly an equal chance of influencing the government's policy and of attaining positions of authority, irrespective of their economic and social class. I take huge issue with this. I take massive issue with this. Here Rawls is saying that the people that should be in political positions of power are those who are best endowed with these abilities or are born to these circumstances to be people in political positions of power. I disagree fundamentally. I think that political power should be very closely held, should belong to local communities, and should not be top-down. That there should not be people who believe that they have the best skills or the most suited or talented to the ability to rule or judge politics, and therefore that they are the best endowed and ought to be in charge. I don't buy that. I do not buy that. I think fundamentally most people are endowed with essentially the same gifts, and in fact, I would quote Michelle Obama when talking about people at the UN, people in the White House, people in Congress, quote, they ain't that smart. This is true. People are generally, more or less, pretty consistent. The thing that sets people apart is early in their path, what do they get interested in, and what do they put their work towards. I think that you would probably end up with a political system that is relatively effective if you just picked random people and put them into positions of power. I don't think that merit is the same as prerequisite talents when it comes to choosing who is in power. I think that this is a dangerous idea. I think that it's elitist, and I think that it sets us up for some of the problems that we see in democracy today. I think that it locks people out, and I'm really disappointed and a little frustrated. Anyway, let's continue on with the chapter where we talk about inequality. A free market system must be set within a framework of political and legal institutions that adjust the long-run trend of economic forces so as to prevent excessive concentrations of property and wealth, especially those likely to lead to political domination. Society must also establish, among other things, equal opportunities of education for all, regardless of family outcome. Here Rawls is saying that if you're going to have an equal or just society, or even really if you're going to have equality of opportunity, which is a necessary component of an equal and just society, that you have to have equal access to education and that you have to have equal access to the ability to grow and develop your skills, and that you have to prevent wealth and resources and land from pulling up in too few hands, because they will necessarily remove the ability for free and equal peoples to express their rights and to express their ability to exercise control over the system. That if resources and wealth pool in too few hands, that they can effectively override democracy, either by running the airwaves with propaganda so that they can directly control what political ideologies are out there or are acceptable, or by doing some combination of that and leveraging their power in corporations to reinforce that ideology. This is something that we've seen historically with cancellation of the Dixie Chicks back during the Bush years, when, because they argued against the Iraq War, they had to go. They couldn't be part of the Overton window. That was not an acceptable idea to express, so they had to be canceled. And now we're seeing this more and more with large companies, with Twitter, with things like that. The fact that the shoe is on the other foot is irrelevant. These people have too much power. They have power over the discourse, and that means that we are not free and equal. We can't all express our ideas equally because some are more equal than others. That's not acceptable. Rawls continues on to the chapter to talk about some of the things that exist or must exist for a just system of democracy to continue in perpetuity and to prevent these inequalities from perpetuating. Warning, caution, gets a little spicy. The government and its loyal opposition agree on these constitutional essentials. Their so agreeing makes the government legitimate in intention and the opposition loyal in its opposition. Where the loyalty of both is firm and their agreement mutually recognized, a constitutional regime is secure. Perhaps we ought to reassess this in light of what happened here in America recently. Perhaps this principle doesn't apply to our current democratic system and is further evidence of our state being unjust at its roots, even by this very centrist, very liberal, in the Western sense, not in the American sense, ideology. Rawls continues on talking about this view of legitimacy. And I gotta say, I don't really see it holding up today. So maybe we really do need to reassess the system that we're operating on. After that, Rawls then continues on to talk about fairness in economics. Let me read an excerpt for you. The basic structure is arranged so that when everyone follows the publicly recognized rules of cooperation and honors the claims the rules specify, the particular distributions of goods that result are acceptable as just, or at least not unjust, whatever these distributions turn out to be. It's worth noting here that Rawls is talking about an idealized situation in which you have an ideal system of government and of society that does operate on these just principles and where these exchanges are or could be considered fair and everybody has perfect and complete information. That is not this system. But we can use this as a test to determine how close our system is. Rawls continues on. Rawls writes, unless the basic structure is regulated over time, earlier just distributions of assets of all kinds do not ensure the justice of later distributions, however free and fair particular transactions between individuals and associations may look when viewed locally and apart from background institutions. For the outcomes of these transactions taken together is affected by all kind of contingencies and unforeseeable consequences. It is necessary to regulate by laws governing inheritance and bequest how people acquire property so as to make its distribution more equal, to provide fair equality of opportunity in education and much else. That such rules of background justice are enforced over time does not detract from, but rather makes possible the important values expressed by free and fair agreements reached by individuals and associations within the basic structure. Okay, so that makes me feel better. Rawls here is advocating that property rights and property more broadly have to be redistributed over time. At what degree and what level is probably up for debate, but have to be redistributed over time in order to ensure equality of opportunity exists, and that is just, because it isn't. Rawls writes in the next section of the chapter here, and since any modern society, even a well-ordered one, must rely on some inequalities to be well-designed and effectively organized, we ask what kinds of inequalities a well-ordered society would allow or be particularly concerned to avoid. So I'm going to chime in for myself here, and I'm interested to see where Rawls goes, and perhaps you should pause and chime in for yourself and write down what you think is going to come up. But what I think are that inequalities should be limited to people's respective abilities and their ability to manage a particular kind of resource or a particular kind of situation. And what I mean by that is that you wouldn't want somebody who has no skill or knowledge or education around computer science, for instance, to manage Microsoft. And at the same time, you wouldn't want Bill Gates to manage a whole bunch of farms. And the resources that are generated from those ought to be distributed in such a way that people who understand them and are best equipped to engage with those resources are the ones deciding how to allocate them for their organization or business. I think that that's probably where this is headed, and I think that that makes sense in, you know, one kind of worldview. And I think based on the thought experiment that we did last week, I think that this could even be applied to the real world, but doing that is more complicated than any system we have today. So I'm really interested to see where Rawls goes with this. Rawls writes further on, if citizens of a well-ordered society are to recognize one another as free and equal, basic institutions must educate them to this conception of themselves, as well as publicly exhibit and encourage this ideal of political justice. So here Rawls is saying that not only do citizens of a well-ordered society have to be equal and have to have this equality for themselves, but they must be taught, they must be shown, they must be convinced that they are equal, or it will not work appropriately. And this is fascinating because this points to some of the problems that we see with, minority groups. We see this in colleges where minority groups do worse than people who are their peers and are otherwise academically as attained as them, who have the same SAT scores, who came from the same high schools, who had the same grades. When they start to get into the higher levels of education, they start to fall apart. Why? Because society has pressured them into this view of seeing themselves as unequal. And when that happens, the Rawlsian idea of justice breaks down. That's fascinating. This book was originally written in the 70s, and he was already considering that if you taught some group or some person that they are not a free or equal member of the society, that the institution will not represent them because they don't believe that it will, and so they won't engage with it. That is brilliant. That is brilliant. What's even better is that he goes on in another section of this chapter, dedicates an entire section of it to the problems of racial inequalities and inequalities of sex, and how if we view races or sexes differently, or teach them in some way that they're not equal, or that women are not the same as men, or are not as capable of men, or can't achieve the same things, that the equality breaks down, that the system breaks down, and that the system can't be just. He covered all these bases in the 70s. It's fascinating stuff. Rawls then writes, and as a framework that preserves background justice over time from one generation to the next, it realizes the idea, central to justice's fairness, of pure background procedural justice as an ideal social process, as explained under the first kind of reason. It also answers to the public role of educating citizens to a conception of themselves as free and equal. And, when properly regulated, it encourages in them attitudes of optimism and confidence in their future, and a sense of being treated fairly in view of the public principles which are seen as effectively regulating economic and social inequalities, as explained under the second kind of reason. So the interesting thing here is that Rawls is saying that if we did have this political system, which was just, people would be expected to be optimistic and confident in their futures because they would know and see that they are equals in the society, and they would know and see that the outcomes of their decisions were meritocratic and just. But we live in a reality where there is no optimism and there is no confidence in our futures. So, one of two things is true. Either Rawls was wrong, which is possible, or the system that we have looks nothing like the system that he is proposing and has led to a bleak outcome of economic, social inequalities that are not just, that are not grounded in what a person is capable of being, as he describes earlier, right? not grounded in what a person is capable of being, but is instead grounded in the economic reality under which they are born and the resources that they are provided. So a little earlier, and I didn't quote this originally, but I'm going to read it now. A little earlier, he said that, quote, "Justice is fairness focuses on inequalities in citizens' life prospects, their prospects over a complete life, as specified by an appropriate index of primary goods, as these prospects are affected by three kinds of contingencies: A, their social class of origin, the class you're born into; B, their native endowments, their ability to do stuff; and C, their good or ill fortune, how lucky you are," right? He says these are the things that should or will decide everything. And then he goes back and says, and by the way, yeah, we need to mitigate everything about the social class of origin too, to a degree, to ensure that everybody is able to use their native endowments, and that their natural luck and native endowments make up the bulk of what decides their outcomes. That's equality of opportunity. However, he acknowledges the reality that social class is a problem and that social class will lead to greater inequalities. And he said that that is a problem, but he hasn't really said how to address it just yet. And I'm still waiting to get there. The little Marxist in me is saying, how are we addressing inequality? Because you can't have equality of opportunity without equality of opportunity, which people starting in different social classes is not equal opportunities, right? It's very vastly different opportunities. Rawls goes on to lay out who the least advantaged people in society are, and hopefully goes on to address how we can kind of fix that. He defines a set of primary goods that every person in a society, including the least advantaged, need in order for it to count as basic justice. The 5 basic goods are basic rights and liberties, which are freedom of thought, liberty of conscience, etc., freedom of movement, and free choice of occupation, powers and prerogatives of offices and positions of authority and responsibility. So here Rawls is saying that even the least advantaged people need to have access to offices and positions of authority. Okay? 4th is income and wealth, understood as all-purpose means, quote, having an exchange value generally needed to achieve a wide range of ends, whatever they may be. So he's saying here that even those at the bottom need to be able to achieve ends that they want to achieve to some reasonable degree. And 5, the social basis of self-respect, understood as those aspects of basic institutions normally essential if citizens are to have a lively sense of their worth as persons and to be able to advance their ends with self-confidence. This is a little more complicated, and I'm interested to see how he unpacks it. So Rawls continues, in a well-ordered society where all citizens' equal basic rights and liberties and fair opportunities are secure, the least advantaged are those belonging to the income class with the lowest expectations. To say that inequalities in income and wealth are to be arranged for the greatest benefit of the least advantaged simply means that we are to compare schemes of cooperation by seeing how well off the least advantaged are under each scheme, and then to select the scheme under which the least advantaged are better off than they are under any scheme. Okay, so I want to unpack this, because I want to see how Rawls goes with this, or whether he goes with this. What Rawls is saying is that a well-ordered society is one in which the worst off are the best that they can be. There will always be people who are the worst off, right? The bottom rungs of society are going to exist in any society. Rawls is saying that we should pick the system where there are not people trapped at the bottom with no way out. We should pick the system that is best off for the people at the bottom. And I gotta say, based on all the stuff that he said before this, it ain't the free market that he just, gave kudos to a little bit ago. It's not that. Rawls continues on in the next couple pages to describe how cooperation is beneficial, and then goes into this bit here. A scheme of cooperation is given in large part by how its public rules organize productive activity, specify the division of labor, assign various roles to those who engaged in it, and so on. These schemes include schedules of wages and salaries to be paid out of output, By varying wages and salaries, more may be produced. This is because, over time, the greater returns to the more advantaged serve, among other things, to cover the costs of training and education, to mark positions of responsibility, and encourage persons to fill them, and act as incentives. Rawls continues later in the chapter. What the difference principle does require is that during an appropriate interval of time, the differences in income and wealth earned in producing the social product be such that if the legitimate expectations of the more advantaged were less, those of the less advantaged would also be less. Okay, so this is important. So now, here's what Rawls is saying, is that we should encourage people to take more advantaged positions, but those more advantaged positions should only exist insofar as they can create more wealth and more goods and more material support for the greatest number of people. So if we ever reach a point where the wealthy are being paid so much that the worst off are worse off for it, rather than it truly building the economy or the system for anybody, that would be unjust. You have to have an economic system where the wealth are capped at what is maximally effective for building wealth for the poor. Now that is interesting, and I haven't seen any studies that have tried to point to that exact precise place on an economic curve, but suffice it to say that I think that a lot of people would find that pretty acceptable. In fact, in a lot of ways, it's really a novel economic system that hasn't been explored. Kind of interesting. In a later section, Rawls talks about moral worth, and specifically moral worth as it pertains to native endowments. And he writes, "In theory, it is said that we do not deserve our place in the distribution of native endowments. This statement is meant as a moral truism. Who would deny it? Do people really think that they morally deserve to be more gifted than others? Do they think that they morally deserve to be a man rather than a woman, or vice versa? Do they think that they deserve to be born into wealthier rather than a poorer family? No. I think people do think that. Maybe they shouldn't. Maybe Rawls is arguing really that they shouldn't think that, or that no reasonable person would think that, but people absolutely think that. I think in trying to set out justice as fairness here, Rawls has finally, for the first time in what I can see in the book here, stepped on an ideology that he either doesn't understand or isn't engaging in good faith, which is a little disappointing. A little disappointing. Rawls wraps up the rest of the book here with some arguments about morality specifically, and talking about moral desert, and has a little bit of a summarization of everything that was covered in this section. Some interesting things that we covered today are how justice as fairness can only exist in an ideological system where men and women are treated as equal, where people of different races or nationalities are treated and taught that they are equals, where the absolutely wealthy cannot oppress or otherwise drive the ideology of the poor, where people of all stripes and colors are able to express their own ability to engage in politics and political discussion in an equal manner, where everybody's voice is heard and is treated as equal within the society. He also highlights that such a society would be one in which everyone would agree to its tenets and wouldn't run off and just kind of disregard them willy-nilly, and that any of these things being missing would be a signal that that society is not grounded in justice as fairness. The next chapter, chapter 3, is called The Argument from the Original Position. I'm really interested to see where this goes. I hope that it goes something like the conversation that we had last week. If it ends a little differently than I'm expecting, perhaps we'll have another conversation like that with someone else and see if we can end up where Rawls ended up or not. Either way, that was all I had for this week. Thanks so much again for listening, and I will catch you next week. Thank you.